This is the In the Rabbit Hole episode archive project. What you're about to watch and listen to is a past episode from In the Rabbit Hole Urban Survival Podcast. You can learn more by visiting intherabbithole.com. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel now.
And here's two guys that got asked to teach fish how to fish, Aaron and Jonathan.
Howdy, and welcome to episode 67 of In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. In this episode, we don't just teach fish how to fish, we help them pick out the rod and the reel. We're your hosts, Aaron
and Jonathan.
And you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Today's show is sponsored by Cat's Coffee. If you're looking for truly exceptional coffee to help you survive the morning or the next zombie apocalypse, you need to be drinking Cat's. They specialize in the finest coffee from sources that prioritize environmental responsibility and are fair trade certified. Their goal is to achieve perfection in every cup. Check them out at Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com, or click on their bright green banner on the site and make sure you're dealing with an official sponsor of the show. Again, that's Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com. Today, rather than just throwing out a list of things you should run out and buy, we thought a much better way of coming at this show would be to actually give you the questions and perhaps even the bullet points of how to make decisions in gear buying. And I think we've come to a point where we've purposely beat up the topic of skills versus gear enough that we're actually ready to talk about gear. And that's a really important distinction. And if you haven't listened to those shows, we're going to link to them in the show notes today. But it is important that you go back and listen to those and understand where the place and purpose for gear versus skill comes in. Because as we've said before, without the skill, the gear is nearly rendered useless, or you won't actually understand perhaps what the gear is meant for, and you may use it in an inappropriate way and either hurt yourself or not accomplish what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and we promise we won't beat that up anymore. So, at least not for this show.
I may beat it up once or twice more. But I'm just kidding. I'm not going to. I think, like I said, I think we've talked about that enough. But this brings up, how do we talk about gear in a way that is relative to the individual? Because that's really the way gear should be looked at. And I think this is a mistake that both Jonathan and I made. And actually everyone I know that's in survival, when they first started off, it is, if they didn't have some just amazing mentor to go to, that this was kind of, it is the most common mistake, which is to we go out on the internet, we're not really sure where to start preparing to begin with. And so we start looking for lists. What should I buy? Because, for the most part, we're pretty lazy animals. And we just want to be told, what do I need? What do I need to do? Just tell me what I need and just let me do it and let me get it off my mind and move on to other things that I find more pleasurable in life. So we find these lists and then we just start buying stuff without understanding what it is, what its full purpose is, how to use it. Does it fit the issues that are going to arise in our lives?
Yeah, let me just jump in. We're not saying there isn't a place for the basics, because there is. There is a basic list of things we all need. For instance, we all need a first aid kit. Now, I just made a very general statement. What I didn't tell you is what we all need in that first aid kit. So that's why it's very easy to make these lists and find them. And I think a lot of people, everyone who's listening to this show has probably found one forum or another that has 50 different lists on it of all the things you could possibly need. And those are probably it's not that they're not a good start, because they are. But I think to Aaron's point earlier, you've got to be able to ask the questions of, all right, it says I need this widget, but what does that mean? What are the components of the widget? Which version of the widget do I need? How many do I need? Those are all the topics we're going to try to cover a little bit more. How to ask those questions, and then maybe even where to find some of the answers.
Exactly. And I think that the fantastic points, Jonathan. And I think we can take the wilderness survival kits we find in most sporting goods stores or even online, and they're very popular, these pre-made kits. And by and large, I don't personally like them because I like to know every individual piece intimately, and I like to pick them out because I will obsess over things.
Sometimes too much.
Often too much. But more to the point, when we buy those things, do we buy them with the idea that, all right, well, now that's taken care of? Or have we asked the question, what do I need this? For example, you'll often find snare wire in those kits. If you are an urban dweller, if you would be classified as a yuppie, if you are not somebody that ever goes out into the wilderness, it would be an appropriate question to ask, do I need snare wire?
and more importantly, what is snare wire?
Yes, exactly.
And I think both of us know, and I think a lot of the listeners know. But again, those are questions you probably, as you go through the list of things on that pack, because whenever you buy those pre-made packs, they always have that bullet list of everything in there. Mm-hmm. If the first question you ask is what is, that's probably a healthy place to start. And if the next thing you do isn't able to answer what each and everything on that list is, you might have the wrong pack, or at least it might be good for you to do a little research.
Exactly. And I actually do believe that even if you are that person we just described, that having snare wire on hand wouldn't be a bad idea. There are a lot of uses for it, and you could actually come to a situation, albeit very unlikely, you could come into a situation where you would actually need snare wire.
Or at least it would be a helpful tool to have.
Exactly. If nothing else, just to play practical jokes on friends and family. I just kidding.
Practical snare wire jokes.
Generally a really
the best kind.
bad idea. So today what we're going to do is to kind of butcher a cliche. We're not going to give a man a fish, and we may not even teach you how to fish, but what we are going to do is talk about how to even pick out a fishing rod and what freaking hook do we even need, and why do we need it, and where are we going to go use it. And it is kind of a concept that we've come up with and been playing around with, and it's the idea that gear follows a spiral, or the need for gear really follows in a spiral. And that spiral is based on location and specific need, because the location will determine the need. And for those thinking, yeah, there's a lot of generalities that can be made, and a lot of this gear crosses over, and it does. But I think if we're just starting off and we're trying to avoid the pitfall of just purely buying off somebody's list, we're going to need some direction with it, and we're going to need to answer some questions. Let's start with, where is the most likely place we are going to be when something arises? Well, if we're following the disaster matrix or the disaster commonality matrix, or however you want to refer to it, it's probably going to be the most personal place you have, which is your home.
Right. Whether you think, you may be one of those people who thinks, well, I spend all my time at work. Well, as long as you come home to sleep and have dinner and breakfast, then most likely you actually spend most of your time at home. You might just spend most of your waking time at work.
And so to start with, we can actually use pretty much it's often called the sacred survival order, or the sacred, I actually am having a brain fart and cannot remember the proper terminology of Tom Brown, but...
Well, now you're killing me, because I knew it like as you were saying it.
Well, I did it
you couldn't remember.
If I'm going to screw it up, I want to make sure you screw it up too. But first, we've got shelter, and it's like, well, okay, yeah, I'm in my house, so I've got that covered. But do you? Is your shelter secure? Can you keep your shelter in its proper function throughout an emergency, barring something dramatic like a nuclear war that just wipes you and your home off face of the planet? Can you keep it from fire, from general mishaps? Because we're going to focus on the stuff that's most likely to happen. Weather issues, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever. So do you have fire extinguishers available? Do you know how to use them? Going back to skill for just a second.
Shh, don't do that.
I told you I'd sneak it in.
Another show. But you make a fine point. Shut-off tools are not easy to use necessarily, or not always intuitive. Is really what it comes down to.
Yeah, do you have tarps in case part of your roof becomes damaged or a window gets blown out or something like that? Do you have the tools necessary to clean up after some sort of an emergency, which is a whole show topic all in itself, and it's actually, there's a whole discussion about it going on in the show topic section of the forum. And yes, that was a plug for the forum, but these are all important things. And then the questions from there become, what are we preparing for? Are we preparing in a very general way? Are we preparing for something very specific? And that, in a lot of ways, once that question is answered, we can start looking at how do we best protect our shelter? What gear do we need? What supplies do we need to keep, like I said before, that functioning in proper order? Then to move on to the next priority, being water. Having water on hand can be viewed as a supply or a gear, and also the containers to put it in. Do we have those? Have you answered the question of how much water do you need? You can base that roughly, these opinions about this vary, but it's generally from 1 to 2 gallons per person per day, which adds up pretty quickly. So we also have, do we have space within our shelter?
And don't forget a half gallon per pet.
Exactly. Thank you, Jonathan. Do we have the appropriate containers to put these in? And how long are we planning to be without water?
Yeah, and something you'll notice is a lot of the kits, these survival kits, whether they're home kits or car kits or whatever, the pre-done ones, water is one of the most vital things that you require. You can actually go a pretty good amount of time without food, especially most of us in the U.S., even those of us who are pretty fit. Could go a long, we might get really cranky, but we can go a long time without food. We can even go for a reasonable amount of time in most places, most seasons, without significant shelter. But what we can't do is go more than a couple of days or a few days without water. It is probably the most critical thing you need, and it is something that, it comes right after air. So there's breathing, there's water, there's food. So when we start talking about the survival hierarchy, everything starts coming after that. Now, fire is important. Again, seasonally, a lot of this is dependent. Fire is important, shelter is important, security is important, sanitation, all the things that, we're going to cover in different pieces of this. But when you look at these kits, they tend to cover different pieces. They'll even cover usually a few MREs. They'll have things for shelter. But water is this piece that they are all glaringly missing. And I don't know, Aaron, maybe you've seen differently, but...
No, actually I haven't. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because it was a point I hadn't even thought of. But you're right. Most kits do nothing to give you anything in the way of either storing water, carrying water, or purifying water.
Exactly. Yeah, at the very least, you would expect a purifying water would be in there. And there are a couple of kits that probably have some iodine tablets and the such in there. But very few have that water purification. Very few have anything to carry water. And none have anything to store water. I mean, when you really think about mass storage, because if you're more than... You think in terms of that let's even just say 1 gallon a day. If you want 3 days worth of water, 3 gallons of water actually gets really heavy really quickly.
Yeah, it's about 30 pounds approximately. Yeah. And it does. I store a lot of water, and I can tell you it takes up a lot of room, and it is very heavy. To the point where, since my home is on a pier and beam foundation, and it's about I think we're going on 90-year-old home here, and it's actually a concern. And I've done things to move water and put water in other parts of the house because water is so heavy that I worry about it.
Were you taking out your floor?
Building a bunker.
Hey, start putting steel pier and beam in there. That should work.
That would be impressive. A little expensive, but impressive.
Oh, like price is an object. Come on.
Yeah, sure. I won the lottery last week and stuff. Wouldn't that be nice? But more back to the topic. You are completely correct. I don't know that I've ever actually seen a kit that fully addressed water. And granted, most of those kits are not for necessarily home use. They're really meant for camping trips and wilderness type situations.
Right. But even the home kits, I mean, just to be fair, even there are a few out there that we've seen for the home, a few that we've seen for the car. And even those don't really adequately address water.
No. I don't know that I've ever seen one that actually gives any way of carrying water or storing water. think the general idea is that they think you're going to go get a water bottle or something. But that's back to the point of, if you don't know the questions to ask and you haven't thought through what are the issues that you could possibly be facing in a general sense, or even in a more specific sense for some people, that may be something that gets missed. Like, oh, well, water is super important, but shit, I have nothing to carry it in. I have nothing to go to the river, get it, bring it back, and then boil it or put iodine tablets in. I guess I'll drink it out of my hands and hope I don't get giardia. Being dramatic, but I mean, you get the idea. To move on to the next one, typically in the survival hierarchy, they say fire. And what fire really is energy, a way of controlling your body temperature, or maintaining a body temperature. And most of the time when we're outdoors, and I think for most survival literature is written, it seems, from a standpoint of environments that are either colder than, say, what Jonathan and I deal with, or have nighttime temperatures that are colder. In Houston, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to get hypothermia.
Yeah, maybe 2 to 3 months out of the year, you could even imagine the possibility of getting chilly.
Yeah, exactly. Like we were joking about in a past episode, I don't even know that I wore a coat at any point this past winter for more than a day or two. So energy doesn't necessarily just mean fire and the ability to keep yourself warm. It could also mean some means of keeping yourself cool. We can also add in the idea of lighting and things like that, although lighting kind of crosses the barrier between energy and security a little bit. So that is something that needs to be considered. What climate are you in? What time of the year are we looking at? Because some regions of the country have very warm summers and very cold winters. What is it? DC has that. I know they can have some very warm, nasty, muggy summers, and then, for me at least, some bitterly cold winters.
Right, or the Bay Area of California.
Yeah.
Another, even in the middle of the summer, you could have some bitterly cold evenings.
Mm-hmm. So that's another thing. What area are you in? What is the temperature like during the day? What's it like during the night? What's it like during the winter? What's it like during the summer? All the seasons. And how do we accommodate that? And there are things where there's a fine line between at what point will you be comfortable and at what point can you get through the situation. Because bad situations, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be comfortable. You're going to make it as comfortable as you can. But this is where gear and budgets and the topic of budgets come into play. We'll save that for the end of the show to really talk about budgeting for gear. And to move on to food. Food is another one of the most basic things that we need for survival. So we have to ask, what is available to me? How much can I store? What are the different methods of storing? Is the food itself gear? For instance, if I buy a pallet of freeze-dried food, is that now gear? It may be more supply than gear, I guess, in the way that we typically think of things. But then gear can also be if you start getting into canning or if you start getting into vacuum sealing things. Those require some form of gear. And so these are questions that, what do you want? What are you going to do? What do you most enjoy? And then that's where we have to go out and actually try these different, because food becomes some people are very picky about food. So how do we then preserve the food? Because different methods of preservation create different textures, which some people are very sensitive to, different flavors. Different methods of canning stuff can very drastically change the flavor of some food to the point where somebody that may like a food item normally really hates it coming from a very specific form of preserving that food or even preserving and storing that food.
And if you're getting ready for a whole family, making sure you preserve food that children will eat or kids will eat versus, you and your wife, that's a different story.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the things that most adults are willing to eat are not necessarily in line with what a lot of children will eat.
Yeah. And then to move on to security, this is another concern no matter what situation we're in. So is our shelter secure? Have we taken steps and have we asked the questions of, is our shelter secure? And what does that mean? And we've talked about putting exterior lighting on a home. We've talked about alarm systems. We've talked about all kinds of stuff. But that's the question to ask. What do I need to do to secure my home? What does that mean exactly? And what are the different aspects of that? And from that, we can figure out what we need in the way of gear. So securing a home, like I said a second ago, could be exterior lighting, but that could also mean firearms as a defensive weapon. That could mean traps and snares again. I'm being a little silly. But so going on, what are the questions? The questions are, what do I need? What do I need from the outside? What do I need from the inside? What do I see happening? What can I imagine happening? And I think if we imagine too much, we start getting into blowing budgets, which we talked about a second ago. And then another aspect I think people don't often take into account, especially when it comes to the most likely, which is bugging in to weather a storm or something, which is sanity. How will you maintain your sanity during a bug-in situation? You have board games.
Yeah, keep a book packed.
Yeah, all of those things. Board games, cards, anything, especially if you've got kids.
Yep. I know in my bug out bag, I've actually got a deck of cards, a little mini dominoes game, and I do keep a book in there that I haven't read yet, but it's probably going to need to get swapped out soon.
So now we have that gear of games and entertainments and ways of keeping ourselves from just sitting around bored out of our minds, irritated at the situation, and then becoming irritated with any other people that we may be also engaged in this bug-in situation. So that's a very important thing, because you get stuck in a house for even 3 days and you could very well be ready to just kill the person that you're stuck with. To then spiral out, the next place we probably spend most of our time, barring people that their office is on 2 wheels, most of us have a job that we go to, and that's where we spend nearly the other half of our lives. And a lot of the same things come into question, and granted, unless you own your own business and the building and the property and everything else, there are some real serious constrictions on it, but you do the best you can with what you've got in the situation that's afforded to you, or you take steps to change that situation. And I'll let you figure out what that means.
And before we even jump into the details here, be sure to take a look at, you probably have an employee handbook or employee guidelines. If it's a big enough company, take a look at those, understand what the restrictions are. For instance, if you are someone who has a concealed handgun license, there are actually a lot of businesses who restrict the use of those concealed handgun licenses on the premises. The last thing you want to do is get stuck in a natural disaster like a hurricane or a major storm at work and then get fired because you did something outside of the employee guidelines. So be careful here. We're not recommending you do anything that breaks the rules or in any way endangers your career.
And I would completely agree with that. The only thing I would add to that would be, if that is something that is important to you, which we hope it is, because we are concealed handgun license carrier, and we're very pro Second Amendment and First Amendment, obviously. And so maybe, and that goes back to what I was saying in the beginning of, maybe it's time to figure out what you can do to change those circumstances. Maybe that means a different job. Maybe that means a different company. It may not be a comfortable or easy move, but it may be something that, if you feel strongly about it, it is important.
Oh, yeah, definitely. If it's something you want to change, then go about changing it. But the way to change it is not to just break the rules.
Exactly.
We are in no way, again, forcing that change by just doing it.
Yeah. So how do we address shelter in a situation? If you own the business, then in a lot of ways you can treat it just like your home. That's what I do with my business, with my family's business, as I treat it in a lot of ways just like my home. It has its own set of provisions and things I'm not going to go into for obvious reasons, but they're there and they're available. But if you're not in that situation and you are the employee and not the employer, then you're better off doing what you can with a small cache of gear. And at that point, it's more about understanding the shelter that you're in, that you then have available to you if you get stuck at the office for a prolonged period of time. Where are the exits? Where are the security flaws in the structure? Are there fire extinguishers? Do you know where they are? Are there other things that would need to be tended to, just like the shutoff valves and stuff like that? Do you know about any of that? And do you know where the tools are, or do you have them? Or is it even within the realm of reason for you to use within that situation and within that space?
And even the basics. So, if you live in a tornado area, you know that the stairwells are usually the safest place to be. They usually tend to be towards the inside of the building. Again, knowing where those are, the fastest way to get there, the easiest way to get there and avoiding, again, in a tornado area or hurricane area, avoiding windows and avoiding things like that. So just knowing what that might be. And you can learn a lot of that without looking like you are that nutty guy trying to case the joint. do it just by walking around. Know your surroundings. You're there every day. I mean, you're there at least 5 days a week for most jobs. When you get the coffee, just take a look around, see where things are. Use the staircase. If you work on the 3rd floor of a building, no need to use the elevator. So going back to our fitness show last time, use the staircase. See what it's like. Understand how the doors work. Once you get in there, are you locked in? Are you locked out of your floor? Knowing how all of that works would be very beneficial as you understand what that shelter situation's like.
Exactly. And then from there, we can start asking the questions of what gear do I need in this space? That gear can mean how that gear is stored or carried in or out is specific to your situations. A lot of people work in cubicles now, and a lot of offices have problems with items growing legs and being stolen. So maybe the gear has to be lighter weight and smaller, and it has to be something that you carry with you in and out of the building every day.
Right. It might become part of your everyday carry bag.
Exactly. Or maybe you are in a situation where you've got an office that, yeah, for the most part, stuff doesn't grow legs, and you have a way of locking things up. And then you could actually start storing some things at your office and have them available to you there. Dry boxes are great for that. We're not going to get into a lot of very specific gear today, but I will say a dry box is a really nice, simple way, as long as you don't get the camoed out ones, because those tend to get funny looks in offices.
Right. And again, this all depends on the office you're in.
Exactly.
If you work in a camping outdoor store, it can be much different.
If you sell propane and propane products, then camouflage dry box would totally fit in the office. If not, then pick something else and be aware of the situation you're in and use that to kind of help you also understand what gear and what the gear needs to look like. Because camouflage as a concept is also important. We've talked about what it means to be gray and what things are gray, and that is a concept that would really come into play in an office situation. So, and that's also another thing of how do we store water in an office situation? I think that one's actually pretty easy, and I think that's, as long as you understand where the water is in the building, you may not be able to stack up a bunch of water jugs in the corner of your cubicle, but what you could do is ask the questions, well, how would I have the gear available to me, and what gear would I need to quickly store up water when an issue arises?
Well, and this goes back to understanding your office space again, too. So you may be in an office space that has the water coolers. If you're in an office that has the water coolers, there's a good chance that there may be a whole bunch of the large, are they 5 or 10 gallon, Aaron? You probably know better than I do.
They come in 2.5, 5, and I believe in some rare cases they come in 10.
Okay. So, but you may be in an office that has 4 or 5 of those just stacked up, ready to go. I know when I was I worked for a large company, and at any given time in any one of the break rooms, there was one in the water cooler, and there were usually 2 spares. And that there were an awful lot of break rooms when you had that many buildings, and that each floor had 4 different break rooms, and all of a sudden you had a lot of water. Now, for the number of people, it wouldn't be enough to get you through days and days and days, or even weeks, but it is a lot of water, and you may not have to shelter down for that long if you're in your office space.
Mm-hmm. And there's the other options of adding in ways of quickly storing water. So having some sort of vessel. There's a lot of collapsible vessels that crush down pretty small and stuff, and you can even just leave them in the packaging. And in the event of an issue, you can quickly go to the bathroom or the break room and fill those up and just store up as much water as you can.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to if you have water coolers and stuff like that. So food's another one. How do we have food available to us if we're stuck in an office? Well, we've showed the dry rations, and I can never remember their name for some stupid reason. They come in a blue packaging. I can always remember the one I don't like for some stupid reason, which is Mainstay. I don't like Mainstay. I think they're disgusting. I'm sure that they will give you sustenance through an emergency, but after eating one, I just felt disgusting and ill, and they were just a weird lemon flavor. Anyway, I'm not going to beat them up too much. But there's dry rations that you can keep. You can always keep freeze-dried food around, and I think that's not something that would be terribly uncommon in an office space for people to keep food in their office space. A lot of people keep candy bars and stuff like that, so putting in a thing of Mountain House or a couple packets of Mountain House in some sort of office kit, or even in an everyday bag, would not be totally outside the norm.
Right. That seems like it would be a pretty easy one. And again, depending on the amount of time you're going to have to shelter in place, take a look around the office. There may be a lot of offices keep dry good foods around. Some offices will have, now I'm not recommending you live off of this for days and days, but there are usually vending machines in offices, understanding where those are, just ways to make things easier on you. And again, if you're in an office with a lot of people, you may have rations, they may not. So it may be best to be able to point out to them. You may not want to eat the food in the vending machine. You may have your own, but to be able to point out to them where the food is, be able to tell them where some additional water is always going to be helpful to you and your safety.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that leads us very nicely into security. And that's one of the aspects of this, of security, is how do you, and we kind of touched on it too, with, do you know the concealed handgun law rules within your company? Do you understand them? Do you know what you are allowed to and not allowed to do? Similarly, are there rules about knives? Are there rules about any sort of weapons whatsoever? Probably unlikely the need for a weapon in general is most likely unlikely. It's still a concern, and it is still something that needs to be addressed. What do you have available to you? What improvised weapons do you have available to you? What is the security of the building? Is it a building that's in a crappy part of town and has crappy locks and it's always getting broken into and there's always issues, or is it a pretty secure building?
Right. Here's another interesting thought when it comes to security, and it actually dovetails into the very last idea, which is, again, just trailing to the same ideas that we had for the home around sanity as well. But security in this case might also involve your own leadership skills. If you are having to shelter in place in an office, or it may not even be an office, but it could be a bunch of places, but where you spend your day, your ability to calm people down and tell them, hey, we're going to be okay because here's where the food is, here's where the water is, here's where we have some extra stuff, here's where we're going to go if the tornado comes near our building. If you have all of that in mind and you have that plan in place and you can share it, it's always best to be able to lead and guide people to safety, because when you can do that, you're actually ensuring your own safety to a much higher degree.
And that also dovetails into sanity in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Have some way of keeping yourself and the people around you entertained. And the more you can keep the people around you as well as yourself distracted, not having to focus on how bad the situation is. And so having things available to occupy your mind and help occupy the minds of others would be very, very beneficial. And another piece that's a bullet point that we obviously wouldn't have added to bugging in, which is getting home. What do you have available to you when you're at your office in the way of gear that would help you get home? If you were without a vehicle for whatever reason, I'm not even going to go into it, just dream up a reason of why you are left without a vehicle and have to get home on foot. What will you need to get there? And then we're back to running through the basics and knowing the questions to ask. How far do I live from my house? Do I need different shoes to be able to walk from here to there? Because let's say you only live a mile from your office. Well, then walking home in penny loafers may not be terrible. It may not be the best thing in the world, but it may not be terrible. Whereas if you are a 45-minute drive from your house to your office, that is going to be one long, miserable walk in a pair of penny loafers or high heels or whatever we're talking about today. We have to consider, how are we going to get there on foot? What do we need? Do we have seasonally appropriate clothing with us? Do we have something extra with us in our pack? Do we have a way of carrying a little bit of water with us for the amount of time it's going to take us to get from A to B? What else do we need as far as security while we're moving about? And the mentality part of whether or not that's a good idea, leave that up to you, and we'll save it for another show.
That is something you have to carefully consider. I mean, just using a personal example, I got stuck at work in Houston, and I can't even remember how many years ago it was, but it was the storm was Allison. It was a major tropical storm that dumped a lot of water on the city of Houston. Now, I ended up being able to get home because the vehicle I had at the time was very capable of going through some very high waters. But had I not been able to use that vehicle, walking or in any way from my office to home would have been impossible. Forget the distance. So I won't even discuss how far it was. It was far enough. But the floodwaters were significant. They were up to I was driving a Land Rover Discovery, and much of the floodwater was almost up to the hood of the car. For those of you that don't know, that's pretty high. Walking through that, there were actually, at the city of Houston, even though it's flat, there were actually currents. There were actually undertows happening, which happens when you have floods in a city and the drains are trying to work but can't work fast enough, things like that. So it becomes very dangerous. So you have to have the right mentality of understanding, okay, is this even safe for me to do? Because I know what it takes to get from here to there, and being able to make that decision rationally. So really taking a deep breath and saying, I know I want to get home. I know I'd like to get to my family, but understanding that you've prepared your family. You've given them the tools they need. You're at work. You have the tool, or in your office or wherever that might be, and you have the tools you need. And being able to make that rational, calm decision of, okay, I can stay right here.
The last piece of gear to kind of consider is, well, if we're going from A to B, have we looked at what that means? Because the way you drive to and from work and home may not be the same and best way to walk to or from home, or however you're going to do it. Flap your arms really hard. I don't know. That's up to you to decide. And that may mean a piece of that gear is maps with a clear defined route of what the best way to walk home from work is. Those are other things to consider. So to spiral out one more time, the next most likely place, and I think these are really the only three places we're going to focus on today because these are the most basic and the easiest to really get our minds around. And the last one is your car. That, in theory, is your shelter, unless you're on a motorcycle, and then I guess you've got to figure out how you're going to shelter. Now we have to look at what are the issues that could arise or that are most likely to arise while we're in that vehicle. Is it a flood, like what Jonathan was talking about? Is it an ice storm? Is it a tornado? Now, how does that interact with the shelter that we're in, which is basically a aluminum and glass cage? So what would we need if we were going to shelter in that car through those situations? What would we need to make sure that that moving shelter can get from A to B as it's supposed to? So is the car in good working order? And does it get checked regularly? Think carefully about that shelter, that moving shelter that we spend that's the other third of our lives. And now, do we have a means of storing water in that vehicle? And do we have a means of carrying water from that vehicle to a better shelter, whether that be back to work or whether that be home or whether that be under a nearby overpass to seek shelter from a tornado or something? And storing water itself, there's questions in that. How hot does it get in your area? Is that the plastic bottle that you're putting it in, because it's probably going to be plastic, and is that plastic going to hold up, or is it going to melt in little pinholes and leak water all over your carpet and then smell like wet, nasty, disgusting, moldy dog or something? Or does it get so cold that the water stored is just going to be a block of ice? And then if that's true, then how are we going to thaw that? So what pieces of gear come from those questions? And then energy, well, if the car is stuck or something, and what are the possibilities of that we need either to be able to cool off or to keep ourselves warm? That's kind of a thing that'll show up in the news about once a year or every other year. Somebody that was driving somewhere on vacation, they got caught in a blizzard, and then a family of four freezes to death. And the dad usually goes walking somewhere and freezes to death before everybody else. Yeah,
either that or the family will survive. Dad goes walking to find help and freezes to death.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always something that happens almost on an annual basis, and it gets even worse every so often you'll hear something really tragic and terrible.
Yeah.
People tend to forget about needing fire when they drive. You ever notice that?
Yeah. Well, and I think we're so used to these cars have become like coons on wheels. Yep. That have these wonderful AC systems and these wonderful heat systems and entertainment for everybody sitting and maybe 2 televisions for every child, or, and just amazing technology. And I'm making fun of it a little bit. And at the same time, I'm in awe of it. We have these rolling palaces, but what does that mean? And what does that kind of trick us into not thinking of as far as what are our needs? What are the possibilities? And what pieces of gear will facilitate that? And that can mean emergency blankets. That can mean used army wool blankets. That can mean those little battery-operated fans for those of us here in the hot, humid swamp that is known as Houston. It can mean a lot of things, and that's where we have to ask the questions. What is the environment? What are the situations? What are we most likely to run into? And this applies to everything we've talked about today and everything we ever talk about, which is focus on the most likely first. And then if you're thinking of something more dramatic, then once you've got the basics down, then it's very easy to focus on the dramatic and figure that out. But you can't figure out the dramatic until you've gotten the basics out of the way. From there, we go on to food. Are there dry rations? Are there Cliff Bars? Are there Power Bars? Is there stuff in the car to keep us sustained? And most likely we're not going to be trapped in a car for a period of time that we could possibly starve to death. So it's more about maintaining body temperature, and it's more about maintaining sanity and comfort as far as keeping something available to eat. And then again, it goes back to how hot does it get or how cold does it get, and does that affect whatever food items are in that pack? And then from there, we can talk about security. Do we have anything available to us? And what is foreseeable happening within the concept of a vehicle, either a moving vehicle or a stationary vehicle? And what are the foreseeable issues that could arise? And then sanity, again, you get stuck in your car, you've got food and you've got everything else, but do you have a way of doing something besides just staring out the window at either the water rushing by or the blizzard piling up around you or whatever? Do you have a way of keeping yourself entertained and your spirits up? And then just like when we're trying to get back from an office, you have a way to get home. And what does that mean? And how far does that mean?
Now, of course, that's in a car. You don't know where you might be. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult. And maybe it's not necessarily home that you have to consider, but maybe a more permanent shelter type.
Yeah. And that can mean keeping an extra pair of comfortable walking shoes, sneakers, or whatever that means to you in a bag in your vehicle. And then there's extra things to think about. I meant to mention these into shelter, so to kind of go back for just a second, since it is our shelter, there are extra and more unique things involved with a car than we think of normally with a shelter, which is, do you have jumper cables? What if the battery dies? Do you have the tools available to you to fix the most basic things that go wrong with a car? And some cars have gotten just amazingly complicated. But do you have tools available to you so that if somebody stops to lend assistance, that they then have the necessary gear available to them if they have the skills to help you fix whatever's gone wrong? You run out of gas. Do you have a gas can available to you to go get and then bring back gasoline? A lot of people talk about carrying a sip of gas in a gas can and riding around with it. Maybe that works in some vehicles that have trunks that are completely sealed off from the cab of the vehicle, but I actually tried that with my Tahoe for a while, and inevitably I take a sharp turn or something gets tipped over, and then I'm smelling gasoline for a week.
Yeah, and you know what? Even when you don't take that sharp turn for some reason, no matter how well you seal those things, gasoline has a way of smelling like gasoline for a very long time.
Yeah, and it's not particularly good for you.
No, not at all.
But at the very least, having the means to procure gasoline, which can also mean, and this goes back to asking the questions, having a means to procure gasoline, what does that mean? I mean, we were just talking about a container, but that can also mean something else. Do you have cash on hand in your vehicle hidden away somewhere so that you could buy gas? Or do you have an additional gas card hidden away somewhere? Do you have some way, whatever that means to you, of procuring gas that doesn't involve weapons? Think about that. What questions arise from that? With that, we can kind of start getting into budgeting for gear. And I think this is very important. And this is, we've joked about this a lot. Of that,
it's hard to do.
It's very hard to do.
And I only say that because it's so easy to get caught up in this gear will save my life. So, of course, I can spend more money on it.
And I think that's why it is so important to decide what can you actually afford to do before you figure out what you want. Because if you figured out what you can actually spend and then maybe even tapered that back just slightly, then it's not as easy to say, well, I absolutely positively have to have this most perfect whatever. Because you can say to yourself and to whoever else is involved in the conversation, we can't afford that. And there's I was watching a video the other day to throw this in real quick, from Ron Hood, and it was a traps and snares video, which is kind of why the traps and snares jokes were flying around a little bit today. But he had a great expression in there and made a good point while he was talking about making traps and snares, which is the concept of good enough and close enough. And that often applies in gear. If you can afford the best gear, then by all means buy that. But it's really more about buy the best gear that you can afford. That may not mean that you buy the $500 or $1,000 custom amazing survival knife. That may mean that you buy the pretty darn good $40 knife that you did a little research on, and it actually will do most of what you need it to do.
And possibly even 100% of what you're capable of doing with it.
And I think that's another thing, too, is we see this gear, and we've talked about this in Gears versus Skill, as that the gear will take care of whatever we want, that it will solve all our problems, and it won't. Good gear will last, and good gear will get us through bad situations, but there are fine lines that must be examined. Is the gear beyond my capability to the point of ridiculous?
And so I do want to jump in with that. So this is a tough one in the sense that we are big advocates of buying the best that you can. And the reason we usually push that is that when you don't do that, people tend to have a tendency to go a little bit cheaper, and then you buy items that are potentially break or won't last. So while we are big advocates of buying the best you can, we're also not saying, and we want to be really clear about this, to go stretch your budget to do that. So buy the best that you can is critical, that you can part, because if you can do that and you buy the best one that you can buy, then you can grow into a tool, you can utilize a tool over time, it may last longer. But that doesn't mean go buy the most expensive you can. It doesn't mean go buy the best name brand you can find. It means look for the tool that is the most durable, the best one, and learn to use it and grow with it. But it does, I know sometimes we push this whole idea that not to buy tools that outweigh your skills. We're not really saying that. And I think that's the part we want to be critical about. We want to make sure you understand that you can buy tools that are better than you can use, but don't stretch just to buy tools better than you can use, or tools that are designed for professionals that you may never be able to use.
Yeah, and I've got an example of that, and it's something that I've done a thing about on the website, and I think we may have even mentioned it in a show or two, which is a match case. And I like to use this example because it is such a ridiculous example of overbuilt gear that I will never need that level of construction. And it's a milled aluminum match case that then the head has been milled out, and the perfect compass that's that size has been introduced in it. And the guy that designed it and made it is obsessive about match cases, and was even able to answer to me why he had a pressure fitting for the lid of this thing versus a screw on, and just amazing, ridiculous detail about a match case. And it's, I want to say, it's like a $25 match case, when I could just as easily have gone, or actually much more easily, and at much less expense, gone down to REI or whatever sporting goods stores was nearby, and bought a $3 plastic match case. What happened was I became obsessive about it. It was within my budget, and it wasn't a big deal, and so I bought it, but it was completely unnecessary, and there was nothing wrong with buying it, because it was within my budget, and because it was the best I could possibly find, albeit in a absolutely ridiculous example that I spent that much time looking at match cases, or asking why I needed a match case to be designed that way, but I did. So, but that goes back to asking questions about what is the situation I'm going to be in, and what gear then meets that. What gear best meets that and meets my budget, which is what we were talking about first. You know, you see this a lot, Jonathan, with guns.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. See it all the time with guns, where people will be buying these. I need what the Navy SEALs have.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. A quite lovely marketing tool.
I was about to say, that's actually what it ends up becoming. For those of you out there listening, and some of you are well aware of it because you've been into guns for a long time, but I'm going to use one specific one as an example. Sig Sauer makes an excellent firearm. I mean, I don't think, Aaron, I know, carries one very regularly. I carry one on occasion. Sig makes a top-of-the-line firearm. The P226 is their premier full-size 9mm. That is the weapon that the Navy SEALs actually have chosen to use. So SOCOM has made a decision that the Navy SEALs don't use the Beretta. They actually use the SIG 226. Please don't email me a million things of guns that the Navy SEALs use. The Navy SEALs use any gun that is appropriate for the situation at hand. but their standard carry weapon now is the Sig Sauer P226. Okay, it's referred to, I believe, as the Mark 25. I think that's the designation it got. Again, don't email me to correct me on that one. It may be some other, it might be 26 for all I know. But SIG has done a brilliant marketing tactic. They took a standard P226, put the night sights that the SEALs don't use on it, put the same coating that's on every P226 on it, and they sell it with an anchor stamp on the side of the slide to designate Navy, and they sell it as the Navy SEAL P226 Mark 25. And for that, you pay a premium of a few $100s for the exact same gun you would get if you got a P226 Elite or one of those guns that's very nicely equipped. That's a case where I look at that and I say, hey, that isn't an issue of buying the best anymore. Now you're buying a name, you're buying an image, you're buying a gun because the Navy SEALs use it. For those of us who become educated on the topic, I actually own a P229. I know, Aaron, you own a P229. It's basically the slightly smaller brother of the 226. I love that gun. I would never buy another P229 just because somebody stamps an anchor and calls it the gun of the, by the way, a lot of MPs, Navy MPs now carry the 229. Or I think they actually carry the 228, same gun for all intents and purposes. I wouldn't go pay extra money just to have that. There's no reason to just have that stamp. Now, for some reason, it means some mass amount to you to have that stamp, and you can afford it. I guess go for it. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about spending money for no purpose. If you're not getting anything additional out of it, there's no reason to spend the additional money. And Aaron, I know you've got strong feelings on that one also. So
I do have strong feelings, and the custom knife maker and I, Phil Rose, were having a discussion about this recently, and I've actually calmed down a little bit about it, but I think it's more of an understanding of, and this goes back to, what can you afford and what is your intended purpose? And this was the conversation T and I were having about knives, which is there are people that buy really expensive knives with the sole intent of putting them in a glass case and putting them on a shelf or a desk, or putting them away in a safe and only taking them out occasionally and just kind of caressing them gently and then putting them back in. For those people that can afford that, that's fine. But and this was a conversation really about why he makes the knives the way he does, which is he makes knives to be used. And so it's all about what's it for. But back to the point of, if we're buying gear for survival, whether or not there is an anchor on the side of a gun or not has absolutely no bearing on how effective that weapon will be. I don't think the guy on the other end of the gun is going to see the anchor and go, oh shit, he's got the Navy SEAL gun.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very small anchor, so the chances are he will not see the anchor. Now, again, if it makes you feel somehow better, I guess that's a different story, but you're right. It is going to have zero impact on the guy across the room from you who is charging you with a knife.
or whatever. But back to the point of, if you can afford it and it is important to you for whatever reason, then that's fine and that's cool. But this is a thing that what we're doing is we're leading into a conversation of, we've talked in previous shows about what to expect going forward in 2012, and this is one of them, and I don't remember if we really talked about it or not, but as long as we're talking about gear, it's going to be an important one to talk about. Because there is most likely, and it'll probably be a 3 or 4 month fever pitch as we get close to December this year, because of the Mayan calendar, whatnot, solar flare, whatever. Whether or not that's what your concern is of no concern to me. But the point I'm trying to make here is there is going to be a lot of really good marketing and probably some really bad marketing around a lot of products that will be misleading or will in some way, and I guess misleading in their capabilities, and also misleading in whether or not it is applicable to you, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to do a show about gear, but from the standpoint of not telling you what to buy, but more telling you what questions to ask and what are the major things that need to be considered when looking for gear, and answering that question of, well, where do I start? What do I do? What do I buy? And I think an example of this that is unrelated to 2012, it's 2 products by the same company. And one is those survival seed vaults. I look at them and they make me want to cry, because I can only imagine how many people are buying those seed vaults and have absolutely no clue how to farm, how to grow those things, or where they're going to be growing these acre-size farms.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you'll have people who have nothing more than a 2-foot by 2-foot area that they could even have one stocking seeds, thinking, well, when the time comes, I'll just plant them in the front area of my apartment complex.
And that may be the case, but I think it's back to, do you even know how to use them? Do you even know where you're going to use them?
Exactly. Well, that's it. Do they even know what that really means?
Yeah. Because I can tell you, putting together a farm in an urban environment, even when there is nothing wrong, giant pain in the ass. Lots of fun.
Are you saying you can't just stuff the seeds in the ground?
You might be able to if you have just incredibly good soil and regular
and magic
rainfall.
Fingers.
Magic fingers helps in all situations. Probably not an appropriate show topic, but
that's a different show on a different channel.
Exactly. But going on to they talk about, oh, well, you'll be able to feed your family and all of this, and well, that's great. Are you also selling it with the farming book and the explanation of how long it takes to actually figure out and do the act of farming to the extent it's going to take to feed your family?
And we all know the answer to that question is no.
Exactly. And they have another product that is actually a pretty good product for what it is. From what I understand, and the very few people I have talked to that bought the product say, yeah, it's actually a pretty good product. The marketing and what they say in the commercial makes me mad, and was a solar generator.
Oh, yeah.
But in part of the commercial, they say never suffer through blackouts or brownouts ever again. It's very subtle, and if you're probably not in the business of marketing, you may not even catch it, and it's just kind of this quick little thing. But that speaks volumes, because if you're just picking that up on a subconscious level or something else, what does that mean? Does that mean it's, to me, if something is going to keep me from suffering through blackouts and brownouts and everything else and never having to worry about it ever again, that means I have a magic fusion generator sitting in my living room that will give me an endless supply of power, which is not the case with one of those solar panels. Maybe you can charge a laptop, or you'll certainly be able to charge cell phones, and that's if you're not through a prolonged period of overcast skies, unless you've thought ahead to pre-charge this thing. And that's where I'm talking about with the bad marketing and misleading marketing practices of saying something that maybe isn't not true. That was a double negative.
Little half-truths.
Little half-truths where it's only true depending on how we look at it.
Right, or what marketing likes to refer to as a lie by omission.
Yeah, exactly. Or misdirection, sometimes, as I like to say. And that is the unfortunate case, and I think those people in marketing give other people in marketing a really bad name. Fortunately, there's a very large part of that marketing community that feels very strong about having ethics and being clear and concise and honest about and actually caring about and loving the product they're selling. But there's always snake oil salesmen out there.
Yeah, and just boiling this back into the budgeting concept, though, and how it all flows together. It's that whole idea of don't allow, and maybe this is the best way to put it, don't allow the marketing to dictate your budget.
Exactly.
And this is why we've always said that skills outweigh gear. And the reason for that is that skills allow you to become educated. Okay, so if you have an education around a product, then you can walk in and understand the differences between product A and product B. And if the only difference is that they've stamped a logo on the side of product B that makes it look a little bit cooler, or they've slapped a tactical front rail on something, or they've done something like that, then you can now, because you have the skills and the knowledge, you can now make the appropriate decisions. And it allows you to better utilize your budget. And the whole concept here is all of us, I don't care who you are, you have a finite amount of money. Okay? It could be large amounts of money, but it's still finite. And if you have large amounts of money, you got it in a way. You got it by working hard or saving or something like that. And therefore, you don't want to just spend it on frivolous things. So while I happen to really like the Navy SEALs and I think the whole idea is cool, I'm never going to spend the money on that little anchor. It's just not going to happen. I don't care when a knife advertises to me that it's a knife that some Navy SEAL at one point in his life might have touched. It just doesn't matter to me. And that's a pretty common marketing campaign. By the way, Navy SEALs can pick pretty much whatever knife they want to carry out. So just about every knife in the world could be a Navy SEAL knife. So again, it just goes to that whole idea that so much more important than the gear is the skills, and the skills become even more important when you go to pick that gear because, not to quote a really bad 80s infomercial concept, but knowledge is power.
And that is so true. And that is where the real idea, as we pushed several times in the show today, is not just going off some blank list of you need A, B, C, D, and E to get through a situation. What you need to do is ask yourself, what is the situation? From there, what are the needs that can be met through gear that I cannot already either meet through skill or something? So what do we need? What are the questions that need to be asked before we run out and before we just go off some blanket list that somebody, whether an expert or not, on the internet posted somewhere? And with that, we wrap up episode 67. Thank you for joining us. This has been an episode from the In the Rabbit Hole Urban Survival Podcast. You can learn more by visiting intherabbithole.com. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more great survival stuff.